Hello and welcome, my name is Trismegistus, and today we're going to be reading through and fusing with the latest Factorio Friday Facts. Friday Facts 420, Fusion Reactor. Posted by Erendel. Hello, I'm sure you're familiar with the good old nuclear reactor. It's a fission reactor that makes a lot of power in conjunction with its steam turbines. The nuclear energy system is unlocked on Nauvis, and in the context of space age, that makes it an early to mid-game unlock. For the planet Nauvis, nuclear power is great for the whole game. Water is endless, and the uranium is plentiful. For space platforms, it's not ideal because it takes a lot of water and a fair amount of space. Solar panels are so good in space, especially in the sun, that it's harder to justify a reactor on a small platform. If you're mainly going around Fulgora, then nuclear becomes more competitive, because Fulgora has more ice from asteroids and less solar energy. Later, when you head to the fourth new planet, nuclear becomes a much better option because the solar power is so low and ice is more abundant. At that point, you've had nuclear as an option for all 5 of the planets, although you probably don't use it on all of them, and a few space routes, so it's time to unlock a new and exciting energy system. Fusion Reactor. This is the Fusion Reactor. This impressive structure converts energy from a fusion power cell into super hot plasma. The structure at a base level makes plasma with an energy value of 100 megawatts, but as you'll see in a moment, you can get a lot more than 100 megawatts out of the system. It doesn't do much on its own though. Those connection points on all sides aren't just for show. And this is the model here. It doesn't have an alt text or a caption or what have you, but I don't think it really needs it. It's a pretty impressive looking building. I thought it might be just worth blowing it up actually. It's nice to get a good look at this. There is an animation that plays, which is the pink sort of line going on here, which as it turns out is the plasma. It's a relatively nice and simple animation, I'd say, which I think is probably quite good because the power stuff tends to be quite simple animations. Obviously solar doesn't have one, but the steam engines are relatively subdued given what they're doing, for example, and the nuclear reactor doesn't really animate at all. Again, it's more just a glow, so this is a very similar thematic style to that. I would say that's quite good. You don't really want your power stuff to be totally distracting, so yeah, it's cool. Interestingly, just to note, it is bright pink, the plasma that's going on, so that's quite interesting. That's not very interesting at all, is it? I don't know why I said that. Reactor Connections. Like the nuclear reactor, the fusion reactor benefits heavily from neighbour bonuses, but the fusion reactor can leverage them a lot more. The nuclear reactor has 4 connection options, but for practical reasons you can't have a running reactor connected on more than 3 sites. Each neighbour gives a 100% bonus per neighbour for a maximum bonus of 300%, which takes it up to 400% of total. You can arrange them in such a way that the central reactor has 4 neighbours. However, the point is the practical point, which is that you would then, the only way of fueling that middle reactor is to hand feed it, basically, because there is no way of getting a chest or any belt or anything like that to be able to put stuff into the reactor or take it out. That therefore makes it essentially a case of you can only get 3 on the side, because if you've never used nuclear reactors, you can't offset them, basically. I don't remember these icons being in the game. I don't know if that's new. It would be quite useful to have that, I think. I suspect not. I think it's probably just been done for this image. But yeah, I'm not sure that wouldn't be quite helpful, because although it's got the 3 connecting points on each side, and you can technically sort of move the reactor down so that the top one aligns with the middle one or the bottom one, it then does not get the neighbour bonus, basically. Now, you can use that because you can use the reactors as like pass-through, and there is sort of ways of using that. But basically, in terms of a normal setup, you would be putting reactors in some kind of 2 by X array, where X goes 2 by 2 or 2 by 3 or 2 by 4, 2 by 6, 2 by 8, 2 by 50, 2 by 1000. You can have them just infinitely go, and you would get the same bonus from all but the end ones, basically. So it's an interesting mechanic, but it doesn't get too complicated, is part of the point. Oh, I should also just note, so alt text has returned on the pictures. So in this first one here, we get just a little thing saying 3 nuclear reactor neighbours. The fusion reactor has 8 connection points, 2 on each side, but for practical reasons, you can't have more than 5 neighbours connecting. Each neighbour gives a plus 100 bonus So plus 500% is the best case, 600% in total. And here we just see them all together. As you can see, it now has 2 connection points, basically. What this half circle is representing is the place you need to place them to get the neighbour bonus, basically. So, as I say, you can actually attach them offset, but it doesn't give you the neighbour bonus. And the difference here is that there are now those like offset, off-centre connection points do let you connect fusion reactors together. So here we see that the building itself has the 8 connection points potentially, but of course there's the same issue that you need to get things in and out of the building. In this case, it's not quite the same stuff, doesn't quite work in the same way, but it is a similar idea that you need to be able to get things into the building, so you can't completely surround it, otherwise you would end up having to hand feed it. And again, although there's no caption, it's been replaced by alt text instead. So the alt text we have here is 5 fusion reactor neighbours. And yes, as we see, this looks like the sort of maximum number of connections you can put on, which is now 2 on each side and 1 at the top. As I say, you could in theory put 1 in here. This means that a fusion reactor with 5 neighbours outputs plasma with a power of 600 megawatts. Additionally, if the reactor is legendary, the base power goes up to 250 megawatts, and the power with max neighbours is 1.5 gigawatts. The neighbour connections line up with the pass-through connection for coolant and a pass-through connection for plasma. The pass-through connections are one of the things that makes bigger builds possible by not having to keep sides open for pipes. And here we see those pass-through connections. The alt text just reads fusion reactor coolant and plasma connections. The sort of light green turquoisey type colour is the coolant, and the bright pink is the plasma. As we saw, that was the actual plasma that was animating in the first video, and the coolant, as I say, is the fluid that we need to connect in. Now, what they're basically saying is that those 2 fluids, because plasma is kind of a fluid, it's a fourth state of matter and all that sort of stuff, but yeah, it's effectively a fluid, and those 2 fluids can both pass through other buildings, the other fusion reactors basically. So here we would be able to pass plasma and coolant all through them. So that ability to pass all of the fluids out and through other buildings means that actually you can hand feed this as well, technically. So in theory, you could have another one here, and that you could feed in the fuel cells, because the fuel cells are the only physical component that needs to go in and needs to go into every reactor. So even though a fluid is required, it can be passed through from others. So you could connect fluid up here or here or here and have plasma coming out of anywhere. And this one obviously would gain an additional bonus from having another building. But again, it's less practical. It's not a practical solution, because you'd have to come and hand feed this. So you couldn't have bots doing it for you or delivering it via belt or anything like that, because you've got a physical thing that you put in and take out. Obviously the building is being rotated around here. We can see the different connection points, and we can clearly see that the coolant comes in via a pipe, and then this plasma goes out via another connection type. I guess because it's a plasma, it would be electromagnetically contained and all that sort of stuff. It's a different mechanism, and it does go on to say that you can't actually move plasma around via pipes, regular pipes. It has to be that direct connection. So this is a way to represent the direct connection without saying, right, you need to put a pipe on it. When there's a valid neighbour bonus between reactors, a special patch is added to the graphics to show the connection. There's a version of the connection patch for when it connects with a coolant pass-through, connects with a plasma pass-through, or connects for a neighbour bonus but without a pass-through function. The juxtaposed images below show the connection patch being added as connections are made by the 2 reactors being moved in. The reactors are rotated so that all 3 connection types are shown in the images. So it's another one of the swipey diagrams. The caption on the bottom just says left, the outer reactors are touching the edge of another reactor but don't connect. Right, the outer reactors line up with other reactors and have a connection patch to show it. Okay, so this is the left one, and the point here, if I can click it properly, is that these 2 reactors, the one at the top left and the one at the bottom right, are not connected to the other 4 reactors, so these ones here, okay? So that you can see that there's no special connection, there's nothing symbolising the fact that these 2 reactors, or I guess 3 reactors, are connected together, and the same here. They then move them both 1 tile over, So we get the top one being moved over that way and the bottom one being moved over that way. And then you see that we get special graphics to show the connection points. It's really quite elegant, this. One of the things that this is also demonstrating is that, of course, the plasma connector is not a pipe, but the coolant connector is a pipe. So we have different types of connection here. So these are connected via the plasma, and these are connected via the coolant, basically. So I think this is a no pass-through connection. I'm not entirely 100% sure on that one, because this doesn't have any of the connecting points. And I think that's because it's effectively connecting the wrong things, if that makes sense. So if we've got plasma connections at the top, we know that we would have coolant connections on the left and right, yeah? So top and bottom, left and right. It's always the opposites because it's sort of passing through. So this one here, we know that the plasmas must be on the left and right because the coolant is connected. So in other words, on the right side of this one, we've got coolant, and on the left side of this one, we've got plasma. So there is no connection, there's no pass-through going on. Okay, and similarly here, this is, if this is the plasma connection here, this is the plasma connection here, this is the pipe connection, this is the pipe connection. So it's just showing us the different orientations. And again, this is having no pass-through effect. Okay, I think that's going to be one of the most interesting aspects of building these, because you probably are going to want to offset some of them in order to get the other machines in. But as you start to rotate things, different things will connect and different pass-throughs will happen. And so you could almost imagine maybe there's a, sort of an S shape or a sine wave type pattern that's optimal for doing some of the connections, and then, doing one vertically as well. So I think that might be one of the more interesting parts of designing these, because in the fission reactor, the pass-through is just heat. So it always, there's no, I've got to turn this in the right direction. It's always connecting in the right way. But with this one, because it has the different orientations for the connection points, you've got to orientate it to get the pass-through. Making plasma. Fusion power starts with a power cell, which goes into a fusion reactor along with some coolant. The power cell and coolant are consumed at a fixed rate, even if the reactor is working more efficiently due to neighbours. A fixed amount of plasma is created, and the plasma temperature increases with the reactor efficiency. The reactor consumes some electricity to maintain the reaction. Okay, so now we get into sort of the practicalities of how it actually works. It's feeding in a blue version of the fuel cell, basically, as well as a pipe connection with a light green fluid. This is obviously the fuel cell, or they call it power cell, in fact. So I guess that's how they're differentiating it between the fission reactor. Fission reactor has a fuel cell, this has a power cell. It is an interesting term to use. The light green fluid then is the coolant. Okay, both are fed in, and it just says here that they are consumed, although we'll see later that actually we get the coolant back again. The building on the right here, just to kind of preempt it, this is the building that actually makes the power. So a bit like fission reactors, what these are doing is actually generating enormous amounts of heat. However, it's not going to use the heat pipe system of the fission reactor. So there's not going to be any kind of declining temperature with distance that you have with the heat pipes. Instead, each neighbour bonus essentially steps up the amount of energy and therefore heat in the plasma. But, and this is one of the interesting things, the amount of resource that it consumes and the amount of power it generates are not proportional. So it's not like coal, where if you want more power, you burn more coal. You burn these fuel cells individually and at the same rate, and they're consuming the same way. But if you've got more neighbour bonus, the plasma increases in temperature, and that translates to more power. So it's effectively giving you like properly free power from just sticking buildings next to each other. Alt text on this one just says fusion reactors making plasma from coolant and fusion power cells. The plasma temperature is not something that you need to pay attention to as a player. The more important value is the power that the plasma carries. So megawatts are more important than degrees Celsius, but in case you're interested, in the basic reactor, the plasma carries 100 megawatts of power and is 1 million degrees C. With plus 100% neighbour bonus, it carries 200 megawatts, because it's a 200% in the reactor itself, and is 2 million degrees C. With plus 200% neighbour bonus, it makes 300 megawatts of power and is 3 million degrees C, and so on. So each neighbour bonus steps it up by 100 megawatts and 1 million degrees C. So presumably with the maximum bonus, you would cap out basically. And that's why it matches the here where you've got 600 megawatts coming out of 5 neighbour bonus, because that's plus 500%. So the individual one has 600% and therefore gives 600 megawatts of power. So it's just a linear scaling, nice and simple. The superheated plasma cannot go into pipes. It needs to either flow through another fusion reactor or flow directly into the thing that actually makes the electricity, the fusion generator. So there we see it, and that's why it's got a different looking connection, because you cannot connect pipes to it. And they're obviously representing that visually with a completely different connector, but it is a connector. Fusion generator. So it just kicks off with a lovely little animation of the thing, nicely shown. We've got the fusion power cells coming in on the bottom left and the liquid coolant coming in on the right. Obviously we've got the actual reactor in the middle here, and then these are the fusion generators. So you've got one on the left, one on the right, and you'll notice there's a pipe coming out of both of them, underground pipe coming out. So clearly there is a waste product going on, and it does go on to explain that. But basically you've got the plasma being generated here and the actual power being produced here. I do love that it's got a little gear wheel on it. Very, very Factorio, these designs again. The fusion generator generates electricity from the plasma and returns an equal amount of warm coolant. It has a maximum power output of 50 megawatts. For a lone fusion reactor with no bonuses working at 100 megawatts, one fusion generator will therefore consume half of the plasma. So just a nice simple 2-to-1 ratio. In fact, the maths on this whole thing seems to be quite simple, basically. It's relatively simple from that point of view, but the complexity comes in the designing, I think, because of how the buildings actually connect together. If the plasma is hotter, then the generator will consume less plasma to make the same amount of electricity. One reactor at 100% efficiency makes 100 megawatts of plasma, so needs 2 generators to fully use all of the plasma. 2 reactors at 200% efficiency each make 400 megawatts of plasma in total, so need 8 generators to use the plasma. 3 reactors at 300% efficiency each combined make 900 megawatts of plasma, so need 18 generators, and so on. So it is a fairly simple scaling. It's not complicated from that point of view. I don't think you would actually get 3 reactors at 300% efficiency unless I'm completely misunderstanding it, because I don't think, my understanding, this one would be getting 300%, but these would only be getting 200%, because obviously they need to be connected to 2 each. And it's the same issue you get, not issue, but the same thing you get with the fusion reactors, where the ones in the middle have more neighbour bonuses, because you're always going to have an end, basically. So you wouldn't actually get 3 generators with 300% because you've always got end pieces sort of thing. I guess they could be in the mid, it could be a block of 5, and so there's 3 with 300%, and that's all it means. But yeah, it's basically going to ramp up. You get more productivity in a sense out of the buildings, because of the temperature. I'm not sure I explained that properly, but yeah, I think it's fairly understandable. Of course, you don't necessarily need to have 18 generators if you have 3 reactors at plus 200% each. If you have fewer, then the system is still as efficient but has less max output and will buffer some plasma. Alternatively, you could have more generators than the reactors can supply at max load, so that when electricity demand is low, the plasma is buffered, but you have more electricity production if there's a sudden peak in draw. So I confess that's a little bit confusing, especially that last point. You would have thought if you have more generators, then it would actually just use up the spare plasma. But it sounds like it might be a smart system where because one of the things with fusion reactors is, unless you do fancy things with steam and all this sort of stuff, it will just consume the fuel. It just burns it and burns it and burns it, because what it's trying to do is keep the reactor at a certain temperature rather than thinking about power draw. This sounds like maybe it has a power draw, element to the calculation, so that basically if you're not actually drawing off the full power, then it'll start buffering the plasma. I assume it reaches a maximum level. There's effectively a big tank inside the building itself. And then when you get a huge demand for power, all these extra generators can use it, just burn it off, basically. I think that's what it's saying, but it is a little confusing compared to how we know the fission reactor works. However many generators you choose to use, how do you connect so many to just 3 reactors if plasma can't go in pipes? Well, generators have plenty of plasma pass-through connections. So yeah, we're not getting a special pipe for plasma. There's no element of this triangular connection here having a pipe connection to it. If you want to use plasma in a building, you have to connect it directly to that building. So it's all about neighbour bonuses. There is no more. The heat pipe doesn't matter. It doesn't have an equivalent to that, basically. So you can't do it through pipes. You can't do it through heat pipes. You have to connect it if you want to use it. But in order to make that practical, we have loads and loads of connection points, basically. So you can offset them to any degree, and it sounds like it's probably 100% efficiency pass-through. Whether the plasma system uses the fluid 2.0 isn't 100% clear to me. It does go on to confirm later on that the lube does use the fluids 2.0, so it's just a normal fluid. But I don't think the plasma is. I think it's a special representation. And this picture just shows them. The alt text says fusion generator plasma connections and warm coolant output. So, as noted, and just spoiling it a little bit there, the coolant is sort of wrapped up into the plasma, and you get the coolant out, but the coolant is then warm. So in a sense, the coolant isn't really cooling the reactor, it's cooling the generators, and it's perhaps how it actually generates the power. So yeah, so you basically get hot coolant. I know that's a weird bit of a phrasing, but the coolant absorbs like the temperature, or I guess the excess heat out of the system. But yeah, loads of connection points, and in funky positions as well. This is not, well, this one is central, but then you've got one that's offset, but not a second one that's offset, which is going to make for some really interesting designs, I think, because you can't just, block them all. I mean, you can obviously just put them in a row, but you can't just put them at any disconnection point. They've got to be offset by a certain amount. And interesting that the warmed coolant only has one side of the building as its output. So, it does explain that you can put this into pipes. It's just a normal fluid. But of course, you don't really therefore have. It's the plasma has passed through. The coolant doesn't. The coolant is the waste product. So you can't just pass the coolant through 20 different generators. You've got to take it out of each generator. So again, it's giving us some interesting options for design. Additional generators can be connected to the end and sides of already connected generators, and then they get a share of the plasma too. There are quite a few plasma connection ports to choose from, so there are a lot of layout options for how to arrange your fusion system. Just make sure the warmed coolant has a way to output too, but you can use pipes for that. Okay then, so this next one's a video. This is Gleba, fusion reactor setup, basically. So they're doing all sorts of pass-through. You've got neighbour bonuses going on with these 4, and you've got the actual generators here. We're doing lots of pass-through, and then they're making sure that pipes come out and connect to the various fluids. We've got the cool coolant. That's a mouthful. We've got the cool coolant coming in from the bottom. There's a little tank as a storage thing here, and it's then being passed through. You remember it has one directional pass through the building, so it's being passed through all of those going vertically. This pipe at the top seems a bit redundant, if I'm honest. I guess it allows them to connect other coolant. The plasma then is obviously going out the sides, essentially, so you can see the connection points and pass-through points going kind of in the other direction. And so we then have a whole load of generators here generating power and making use of all the various different connection points. But note again, you need to be able to output the warmed coolant from the generator because you can't pass that through, basically. That all then goes into a sort of a ringing pipe system, which takes the warm coolant back out again. The power cells are being delivered via bot, basically. The heated coolant needs to be cooled back to its cold state. There's a special machine for that, but we'll save that for another Friday Facts. Development. Going round in toroids. Just a little interjection. This is where it gets into more like technical details and like background information and that sort of thing. It is quite a long Friday fact. I found this, and as I've said before, this sort of techie, behind the scenes type stuff I find fascinating, but all of my speculation will be at the end if this is not really your cup of tea, so feel free to skip forward to that. We wanted an end-game power system that would be powerful. We've had a portable fusion reactor in the game for a long time, so fusion seemed like an obvious thing to consider. After considering a few other options, fusion was the one added to the initial prototype. So yeah, fusion always seemed like a weird thing. It was always a bit weird that the portable fusion reactor, the thing you use to power your system, power armor and all that sort of stuff. Obviously you can also put it in Spidertron. But it always seemed a bit weird that we had this, miracle of infinite fusion generation that we could use to power our power armor. And it was producing significant amounts of megawatts, but you don't have to fuel it. Weirdly, the engineer somehow knows how to make a small fusion reactor, but can't make a big fusion reactor in the base game. And fission isn't sort of something you use for the personal, power system. Now, obviously, the two were introduced at very different times. You had a personal fusion reactor in the game way before you had the whole nuclear fission power thing. So it's understandable why there's the disconnect there, and also obviously if you've never realised the actual icon that what the fusion reactor is based on the Back to the Future Mr. Fusion, which powers the cars in the future. So there's a bit of an element of getting a reference in there. But yeah, it always seemed like a gap that somehow the engineer can do one at scale and not the other. It doesn't sort of make sense. So filling that gap sounds like a perfect thing, and they even go a little bit further. There's a bit later on about like properly filling the gap and properly making it step between them. The first prototype version of the fusion system that I made was pretty crude. In theory, the original version had a lot of similarities to the system we have now, but it took a long detour along the way. When prototyping something new, it's often a fight with the game engine. For a more representative portrayal of the gameplay concept, a lot of things can be faked with scripts. The problem is that using scripts can be terrible for performance, and it can take a while to code too. So effectively this is going back to a point they've made in previous Friday Facts, where they test out gameplay systems a lot of the time by doing a mod, basically. So when it talks about scripts and faked and all that sort of stuff, it's because it's done via a mod. Now, one of the things with mods, Factorio has some of the best support for mods I've ever seen. It is literally like designed into everything. But the mods are always a bottleneck, a slowdown. If you're ever having performance issues and you've got mods, consider getting rid of the mods, basically, because it will be the mods that will be a significant part of the problem, because they're not integrated into the game engine. It's always having to go out to some other code, execute that other code, and then come back, and basically that process is always going to be slower. What Andorra means by fighting the game engine is that the Factorio game engine is built for Factorio. It is not a generic game engine. There's a lot of shortcuts and optimizations and cheats, in a sense, that you can do if you know your game is only going to do certain things. You don't have to worry about, what if someone adds this or that or the other. And so therefore that actually acts as a barrier when you're trying to add things, because you're adding things in a way that you would need to completely rewrite bits of the code, or really basically do the final version of something just in order to prototype it to test it. So instead they do it as a mod, but of course mods are slow. The first gameplay prototype for Space Age was a big mashup of all the ideas so we could see what works, what doesn't, and cut it down to just the best bits. The gameplay prototype was designed for the main branch, stuff that everyone plays on and is designed to stay in the game. So a heavily scripted mock-up of the fusion system was a big no-no, because it would be slow and need to be removed later anyway. The gameplay prototype was also made very quickly, so there just wouldn't have been time even if we did want something scripted. So that's kind of the real point, basically. So it'd be fine if just Erendel was messing about with it, and this is kind of what he goes on to say later on, but if Erendel was just messing about with it for themselves to test it, see what it's about, see how it works, test some ideas, fine. If it's being done in these LAN parties and all this sort of stuff that we've talked about in previous Friday Facts, then it's not going to work, because it has such a performance impact, and it'll be kludged together code. It's not optimized, it's not performant, it's a bunch of ideas thrown in there, get it working. And if it's too poor on the performance, people are just not going to use it. It's just going to represent a massive slowdown, could impact any playthroughs that are going on, etc., etc. So that means it was not ideal, but also the point was that this was put together so quickly that working out how to do all that coding, it just wouldn't have worked, basically. The other point, of course, then is that because it's all clutched together, it's just thrown together, and they needed that quickly, they wanted that quickly. And so doing a whole mod that takes months to do was just not going to be viable. Instead, a crude representation of the fusion system had to be made, just by representing the steps that happen to items and fluids. This ended up being a series of crafting machines, like an assembler or chemical plant, but with fixed recipes. And this is a diagrammatic representation of it, basically. So these are the grey boxes they use for just prototypes, basically. And the alt text reads, the first fusion prototype had technical limitations, so it's just a collection of crafting machines with fixed recipes and an add-on generator to make electricity. I'm going to read this through and try and sort of explain what the simplifications are. Basically, if we start on the top left here, we've got the fusion reactor itself, and it says that it burns fusion power cells to function, so the blue things you put in, and that was clearly in the game. They were having to produce those cells and then using them up in the machine. So it'd be like some assembler consuming iron plate or something like that. It was done as a fixed recipe crafting machine, so it's just a normal machine, not actually producing power, but consuming fusion cells. Okay. It also has an input for cold coolant, and it outputs plasma. It's taking in a solid item, the cells, a liquid item, the coolant, and it's outputting the plasma, which I'm guessing was probably represented as a fluid. The neighbour bonus was explained in a tooltip, but can't work because it's a crafting machine. So the neighbour bonus just doesn't work, basically, because in the code it's probably only applied to fission reactors, and this isn't a fission reactor, it's a crafting machine. Okay. Now that's actually one of the main flaws here, because you can't really tell how this works at scale if you can't do that neighbour bonus, especially if it's going to have that even more neighbour bonus compared to a fission reactor. So that's one of its possible flaws in sort of how this is being represented, because what's the point of using it, basically? I guess they could have had something where it was like a switch which says I'm simulating 4 neighbour bonus or something like that, and that would ramp up the consumption, but we know that the consumption isn't intended to change, it's the amount of plasma, so it would need to change the recipe, I guess. Could have done something like that just to fake it, basically, but then what's that really showing you? The next grey box underneath that then is the fusion generator, part 1. Okay, this is a fixed recipe crafting machine, so again it's a crafting machine, not an actual generator. It handles the fluid conversion side, and therefore you input plasma and output warm coolant. So we're then doing a fluid conversion. So effectively it's like a chemical plant or something like that, where you're putting in oil and getting out petroleum or something like that. So it's effectively doing that type of process. It also outputs, I believe as a secondary thing, a dummy plasma, which can be used for the electricity. So that's like producing steam, essentially. So if you imagine that the generator is producing a steam analog, which it's calling plasma, and that can be then used in a separate machine to generate electricity. So it can't make electricity, so needs this part 2 add-on, because it's a crafting machine, and there's no way a crafting machine can make electricity, only consume it. So you then need this additional little building here, the fusion generator part 2, and that's the one that makes electricity. The fluid is destroyed, so like steam, it's just consumed, so it would break the loop if it consumed the real plasma. And that's the point, because you want this, Arundel's intention with this is to have a loop system for the coolant, basically. So if this was eating the plasma, then it would be eating the coolant as well. And of course you don't have a system in the game at the moment where it can eat a fluid and give out another fluid, basically, to make electricity. Obviously a chemical plant does that, but it doesn't produce power. Instead it consumes only the dummy plasma. So this secondary plasma is what it eats in order to make power. You then got the cooling. This isn't explained, and it's deliberately not explained, because this is clearly another building that they've mentioned. I'll be speculating about that, but clearly this is a system and a process that they want to explain in a separate Friday Facts, or I guess maybe leave for people to discover in the actual game. But basically that then takes in the warm plasma and outputs the cold fluid again. Also, a machine couldn't make electricity and convert the type of fluid from one type to another at the same time. In other words, it can't be a chemical plant and a generator at the same time in the base code. In the case of the generator, it needed to have a crafting machine for the fluid conversion, but that meant there needed to be a separate entity add-on just to make the electricity. It has to generate two fluids, one that it can burn to make electricity and the other to simulate the cooling recycling. In all, the system therefore ended up as 4 entities that did weird things and a lot of long tooltips. The tooltips tried to explain to testers how the makeshift representative entities worked now and how the things were supposed to work in the final version so people could understand what the system was trying to do. Long story short, the makeshift system was confusing and seemed way more complicated than the final result would have been. So this is one of the problems with grey boxing as well, and this is kind of what it's talking about, and how a mod works compared to the base game, etc., etc. Is that it's difficult sometimes, and I guess we saw something analogous with the music where it doesn't matter how many times you're told it's a prototype, it's a proof of concept, it's what have you. Making that break in your mind and saying, right, that's just a separate thing, it's its own box, I'm not going to think of that in the main game, or I'm going to look at that critically and analytically as a system and not think I'm playing this in the game, this is how it really is. Doing that is actually a bit of a skill and a bit of an art. Tim Kane has a really great channel if you're ever, if you're interested in programming or game development in particular, then I'd highly recommend it. And he's talked quite a lot about how he's good at just playing games with grey boxes, but that's not a skill that a lot of people have. They play the game and they just don't get it. It doesn't. If it doesn't look right, then they can't play it properly, basically. And that's not a sort of criticism. It's just it's very difficult to make that disconnection, to disconnect the two and see, right, well, this system, I need to look at this system as even though it's a horrible table full of numbers, it will be a nice UI eventually. Or this square box is going to look like a really cool fusion reactor. Doing that sort of mental leap can be a little bit of an art, basically. For context, this is similar to how the first asteroid collectors worked. Asteroids didn't exist at the time, so instead you just had something like an assembling machine that produced asteroid chunks and they could be placed anywhere. It relied on people reading the tooltip and understanding that machine should only be placed on the platform edge to be able to test it properly. This also confused some of the playtesters, so some of them didn't try to play with the placement restriction, or even got confused about why they could just craft asteroids from nothing. At least simulating that mechanic only needed one self-contained entity, not 4. In other words, the asteroid collector, the grabby arm thing, in the base game, you're only going to be able to put that on the edge of a platform. It needs a free edge for those arms to come out, okay? None of that functionality was in the game. It was just a grey box where it was an assembly machine where if you turned it on, gave it power, presumably at a random chance, it would just give you an asteroid chunk. And that was meant to simulate asteroids being collected in a random way, okay? But asteroids weren't there. There were no asteroids. So a tooltip was put on saying, only place this at the edge of a platform. So if you don't read that tooltip, or you don't quite understand what it means, and you put it in the middle of your platform, and it's suddenly just spawning out, just generating asteroid chunks, then you would be like, well, why is it doing that? How does that work? What's this representing? Etc., etc. So you lose some of the subtlety because of how you've got to get it to work as a mod, basically. Anyway, the fusion system was then simplified to a standalone fusion reactor, which was essentially just a burner generator. With this one entity, you just put in fuel and get power out. No fluids, no waste, no other complications. There was some consideration for this to be the final version, but it just felt really bad to use. The system was too simple. Often simple is good, but sometimes it is the absence of good. Okay, so another slidey diagram. It's quite a big one, so I'll just scroll off the edge a bit to read the caption, which says, left, a rich system to interact with. Right, the power density is impressive, but it feels a bit sad. Left side then is a full-on 2x4 fission reaction system where you've got the reactors in the middle, fed by bots bringing fuel in and taking the wastes out. You've got a steam tank set up, as this one happens to be, with the whole heat exchangers, making steam and putting it in the tanks in order for storage, and then sending the rest of it into the actual turbines. You've got the turbines themselves. You've got the challenge of putting the water in, getting all of these fed with water. I'm not entirely sure that this would actually self-sustain. I think that's not quite enough water for what it's doing. But yes, so it's a system to build. You've got restrictions, you've got limitations, like the heat pipes here. You have that declining heat pass through, so the ones at the end here are probably not getting as much heat as the ones at the front. So if you build them too big, it can decline to the degree that it's a bit of a waste of the heat. These guys, as I say, have a space issue in that you ideally want to put them in nice rows, but you've got to get the power out of them. As I say, you've got to get all the fluid in. This is a notoriously water hungry system. Heck of a lot of water needed to sustain it. And as I say, I'm not entirely sure that that's enough offshore pumps. And I say, if you want to, you don't have to, but I mean, this is all hooked up with steam batteries, I think, but you can effectively have a steam battery that only puts power in, etc., etc., etc. So nice level of complexity. One of the things that's interesting with nuclear power is it is like entirely optional. You don't really have to do it. You can just keep going with solar and accumulators, but it's therefore an optional system that if you wade in, you can mess about with. I have seen so many reactor designs, super cool ones, super simple ones, etc., etc., that it's a fun system to play with, that because it's optional, you don't need to feel that you've not done the most optimal thing. That's replaced by a single grey box. So what Erendor's basically saying is, because of this complexity, they ended up just sticking in a single grey box that is a single machine that takes in the fuel cells, no they're not, the power cells, and just makes electricity. And because it's so simple, there is no challenge, okay? A key element of game design is creating or having friction points and challenges in order to make it interesting. Because if everything is just too simple, then the lack of challenge means it's not fun. It's a bit like one of the things I always say, I really like the creative mode mod, and there is obviously the editor is the sort of native version of that. It's really fun to mess about and design things in the creative mode. However, eventually it gets a bit boring. You do have some logistical challenge and what have you in there, but generally speaking, you can solve everything by just sticking in a new thing that is completely free. So there is no challenge in producing all of the buildings, and everything places instantaneously, so you don't have to wait for things to happen. And one of the biggest problems with it is that you like spawn fluids in, and the pipes are just 100% full instantaneously, and you don't have to worry about the fluid mechanics, and you don't have to worry about getting the fluid out of the trains and all that sort of stuff. So all of that just kind of goes away. And after a while, it stops or loses its fun because it's too simple. Yeah. Part of the fun comes from it being a challenge to actually do. Okay. And this is this Soulsborne thing of they're very challenging, they're very difficult to understand and know how to win. And that's why people enjoy them. The difficulty makes it fun. Having to overcome a challenge is kind of what gaming is all about. And that's one of the reasons that, a game like Factorio remains fun, even though you get lots of tools like blueprinting and bots and all this sort of things. They let you overcome like the early game challenges, but they create new challenges. They create new difficulties. They create new challenge. Okay. And you as a player can also introduce your own challenge of saying, right, well, I want to build a super duper mega efficient 2x4 nuclear power plant with a steam battery. Somebody else may not want to do that challenge, but that's the sort of point basically. And so by having just a simple box, you've reduced it so much that it's like, I don't know if this is fun to play because there's nothing here for me to mess about with. If the use case is niche, then it can be good to have a simple system to replace a complicated system in some instances. The danger is when a simple system replaces a complicated system in every instance. If you have to replace all your interesting builds with boring builds, then it hurts the game overall. That's the sort of thing that might feel nice in the short term, but feels bad or shallow in the long term. And that's what we found with the Fusion as a burner generator. which kind of loops back to the point they were making about the beacons, in that you end up with every build being exactly the same 8 or 12 beacon design at its core. Obviously it's different because it's different materials coming in and what have you, but the same design solution solves every problem essentially. You're not fundamentally changing the design in order to get a different result. And that's what you do have with the nuclear, because you literally could not, if you wanted to go 2x5, you literally could not use this design. You would have to come up with a new design. It might be sort of very similar, but you could not use that. If you wanted to go 2x16, you would need something completely different again. And so the point is that with fusion in like this, there is no design, basically. It's just slap the building down. Maybe there's challenging getting the material, the source material, what it's burning. But fundamentally, there is nothing to test here. For a while, it seemed like there was a good chance that the fusion reactor might get removed from the game completely. And that was still the case when the time came to make the design for the building. It was clear that if fusion was going to exist in the game, it would need much more of a justification for its existence. So, before starting on the concept art, I went back to the original vision for the system. The original prototype never had a real chance. It had some good features, but I felt like there was even more that we could do with it. I started playing around with the idea of making fusion more like a modular building, a set of structures that connect directly together so that you can't use pipes to separate them. I tried a lot of different options and arrangements and found a set of patterns that showed a lot of potential. One of these options fit with the existing entity sizes, so I started testing with that. So I'm not entirely sure what Andrew means with that. This mess of a building says testing the new shapes to the limit is the old text, and the caption below it says testing an arrangement to its limits, 1.4 terawatts per block. For rapid prototyping of many options at once, the bounding box of a potential entity is represented by belts, and pumps are used to represent the connection points. Yeah, I say this is a little bit beyond me exactly what's been done here. I think it's basically just slapping down loads and loads of different shapes and orientations. It's basically the point I was saying, that there's all these options for connecting this thing together, and so different shape sizes and connection points and all that sort of stuff. By testing those, it's kind of testing out like how many possible combinations there are. I think that's like the aim of what's going on there, but I don't know. Basically, so this one's a little bit beyond me. With an arrangement that worked, the next hurdle would be to make sure that this option could work with a good design for the structures. The designs had a number of constraints, but by far the biggest constraint was all the connection points for fluids and plasma. This is often the case for things in Factorio, but the fusion generator took it to a new level. The other constraint, beyond the usual best practices, were that the main reactor building should contain a torus to indicate a tokamak, which is the magnetic constraint system. I also wanted it to have a central tower that is reminiscent of the portable fusion reactor icon, because that's part of the game's history and shape language. The generator is less focused on steam than our other generators, so the design should lean more towards featuring the rotor and or stator of the electrical generation system. The generator also can't have only 2 rotations like the other generators, it needs 4. And because the direction is so important to building, you need to be able to tell the direction at a glance. So a little bit to unpick there. The early line art for the fusion generator and fusion reactor is what the alt text says, and it just says some early line art in the caption. I mean, first off, the designs look awesome as per usual. And the basic point is, so I'm going to do a little, as a special thing in the extras, obviously skip it if you know all about them, but I do a little just explanation of how fusion works and like the prevailing approach to generating power from it. But it uses something called a tokamak, which is basically like a donut shaped structure. And so that's what you see going around here. This is the donut shaped or bagel shaped structure. And then the point is that because the portable fusion reactor has that Mr. Fusion shape, which is actually a food blender, basically. It's been using quite a lot of props because of the the sort of design of it, but it's basically like a food blender. That's pointing out the top of that, that sort of curved tower structure coming out the top to make it seem like that's a necessary part of doing fusion sort of thing. This is obviously the generator. What it's talking about, the stator rotor thing, is it makes it more like an electric engine working in reverse. So it's essentially being turned, and the rotator is essentially generating power in the stator. As I say, I'll talk about it later, but all a fusion reactor does is generate heat, and actually you would use water in order to get the power. So it's a little bit of a cheat that they're going for, and obviously it's fine, and that's like the point of it. It's a power generation system that doesn't use water for planets that don't have water. But yes, so I say it's a little bit of a cheat they're doing, but it's kind of like reverse engineering a motor and like saying, right, well, somehow plasma turns this rotor and that generates power in the stator. So yeah, clearly this is like the outer housing, and what's in the middle there I think is meant to be magnetic coils, basically, so that it's the actual rotation of those coils that's generating the power essentially. I would also say, so this is just a little bit of a weird observation, but if you look here, and it's because it's carried right through into the main building, and here we go, there's like a little smiley face in the thing. And if you look at that, does that not look like a sort of a robot's face, or like a sort of a helmet, like a robot, helmet? And it's obviously, that's like the neck part, and then this is the mouth, and these are the eyes. I don't know. It's a sort of a weird design thing. I also love that it's got like an exhausting pipe here. I wonder what the heck that's meant to be used for. But yeah. I mean, I love the design. I mean, I've said this a million times. With a workable start to the design, the next step would be a demo of the entire fusion system that would rely heavily on Lua scripting. Instead of using proper entities with recipes for the processing steps, it was all faked with scripts, the opposite of the original prototype. It even had the critical connection and status information drawn over the entity in alt mode, so it was easy to see what was going on. This made the performance terrible, but that's okay because it would never be merged into the rest of the game. It's just a standalone demo. What it's basically saying is that it even had the alt mode on it, yeah, so you could see where the connections were and what was meant to be going where, etc., etc. It was therefore basically a simulation of how it might work in the real game, and using the actual initial idea of the multiple buildings, but bringing in these concepts of plasma can't be put in pipes, we have lots and lots of connection points, and getting rid of the fourth building, basically. The demo also made it possible to get a realistic impression of the working system with the correct number of entities in the process, correct connection bonuses and restrictions, an inability to use pipes, custom tooltip overlays, and so on. Also, now that people had completed the game, they had a better understanding of what sort of systems would be interesting to play with for that part of the game. And here we see, I think that's, version 1, as it were, is this scripted prototype. The caption just says, version 1 of the concept art, 900 megawatt system, no spoilers here. Alt text just says, fusion demo version 1 with a generator size of 6x4. So I think that's bigger is the point. I think the generator is a smaller building in the actual thing. The no spoilers part refers to this building here. This is the cooling building because it's outputting the cooled coolant, and it's inputting the warm coolant at the top here, so it's processing that. It also seems to have a one-directional pass-through, so the hot one, not pass-through, but one-directional processing, where the hot stuff comes in at one side and the cool stuff goes at the other, and then there's not other connections on the side. So again, it's a routing challenge and what have you, but it's a fluid, so it's a more familiar system. I'll be speculating about what that is later, obviously, but this sort of shows, if you compare this to the box, to this, yeah, you can see that this instantly looks more interesting. Now, whether it would be properly interesting to play with is then a decision they can make based on having a prototype to mess about with. But instantly it looks like there's things going on. You've got to manage systems. You've got options for how you design it and what bonuses you go for and what outputs you want and all that sort of stuff, what sort of scale. The other point that's been made is that having played through the game, What this is for, what this power is all about, is things like the Foundry and the EMP and presumably some other later game buildings. Especially, I assume, in Legendary mode, I think power demand goes up. But we know, and we've been told, that the Foundry is an enormously power-hungry building. It's enormously productive, which is your benefit from it, but you got to power it. And if you're having to power, say, 50 Foundries because you want some big mega base, that's probably a power demand that's off the current charts. You're probably talking about, this terawatt solar panel, thing that I did in my mega base playthrough, where it just became a tedious chore to keep grinding out solar panels. Now, you would have the thing of, well, we can make them legendary, so there's more power out of them, what have you, but making them requires you to churn through a lot of production, okay? So even though you could place them in a small area and it would be a bit more practical from that point of view, you'd still have to churn through hundreds and hundreds of solar panels to get your legendary ones. So you're still having to do massive production in order to parallelize, to make in parallel all of those solar panels that you need. So you're still requiring enormous, fields of smelting, because of course you're trying to power your foundry, so you can't necessarily use them as such until you've got the power. But you're having to bring in all your resources, you're having to process it all, you're having to put it on trains and send it away, and all that sort of complexity of process, which is good because it's interesting, but can become tedious because it's just the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. If you chunk it down to some system that in and of itself has complexity and design challenge, but this entire footprint is a, say, half a terawatt design, or did it say? No, 900 megawatts, so it's very nearly a gigawatt in just this tiny little area. Yeah, you're getting the power that you need without having to completely concrete half of Nalvis, This made the system much more understandable, so I introduced V to the demo and it was well received. From there, we refined some of the specifics of the system. The biggest change was altering the size and connection points of the fusion generator. The original design didn't have an output connection point for plasma on the opposite side as the input, so the add-ons always had to be at 90 degrees. But V felt that this limited the design options a lot, which was correct. An easy linear arrangement didn't work well either, so we spent a while trying many different arrangements. This next picture then just has alt text of blocking out options in Blender within instance geometry, and then the caption just says getting crazy with options in Blender. Basically, these are messing about with possible connection points and possible orientations, possible building sizes, to see what would be some of the designs that people might come up with given different sizes of buildings and different positions for connections, etc., etc. And they're just iterating through a whole load of options using these very simple block buildings in order to see, right, well, what gives the most interesting set of design options. And eventually I found a 3x5 design where we were both happy with the number of build options. The new size meant that concept graphics needed a bit of redesign to fit the new aspect ratio and connection placement, but that wasn't too bad. Then, after we balanced stats a bit more, it was finally ready to present to the team. And here we see it, updated concept art. The caption says, reactors for a 9 gigawatt system, 22.5 gigawatts if legendary. And the alt text just says Fusion demo version with a generator size of 5x3. I mean, obviously it's different sizes of buildings. This generator is a lot bigger. But note that we're using 3 generators here to get 900 megawatts. And 18 then gives us 9 gigawatts. But if you look at the footprint, it's not massively bigger. And we've gone way bigger. And it's because of that scaling of the adjacency bonus that you get like even better, like compression essentially, like you can fit more in because you can offset the buildings and you have to then fuel them and all that sort of stuff. But you don't have to worry about them all being 2x, 2x7, 2x1, 2x4, all those sorts of things aren't a problem. So you can go with circular designs, you can go with more in the in the middle and together and all that sort of stuff, and it can therefore be more, you can do a lot more circular shapes with no problems. And of course the plasma from this one can go out to this one here without any problems, basically. You know, there's no heat pipe loss distance thing going on, so it allows you a lot more freedom with your design, basically. The presentation went well and the proposal was accepted. Boskid coded up the new system based on my demo. I then upgraded the concept art from the placeholder quality to some more detailed versions ready for the next stage of production. The final graphics were made by Jersey and they look great. They also managed to figure out how to get animated effects on the connection patches, which we weren't sure would be possible during the design phase. That just means like the corners and stuff, where it's connecting together, it has animations on it. Yeah, so that's just like the connection points, basically. So the basic point here is this is it goes between them, basically. So if you look at the edge of the building is there and the edge of the building is there, and that goes across them. So that's the challenge, basically. You need the animations to kind of work across them, because one is in one building, or one half of it is in one building, and the other half of it is in another building, and they're touching. So you've actually got like a cut, basically, between the two things. But if you look at it, the fluid is clearly flowing across, or plasma rather, is fluid flowing across, and that's the point, basically, that they managed to work out how to do that. The system hasn't changed much since then, with one exception. The original version had a fluid reservation system, where a generator wouldn't let fluid pass through until it was some percentage full. This meant that they'd fill up in a chain or tree pattern, and the percentage of glowing generators would be the percentage capacity you are using. That feature was lost with the fluid system rework, because now they all draw evenly from the same collective pool of plasma. And that's not a reason to open the fluid argument again. But the basic point is that this reactor here, this generator rather here, would fill up with fluid, and therefore it would be working, and then once it got above a certain amount, that fluid, that plasma would then pass on to another one, and pass on to another one, and pass on to another one. And so you would get this thing where the ones that were close to the reactor had plasma and therefore had power, and then as it went through, the ones on the outside would kick in or not be working, and so you would be able to see, all right, well, all of my ones on the outside aren't working, they're never working, I've not got a very good design, basically. And so you're not allowed to use that to reopen the fluid thing. Portable fusion. Even though this Friday Facts is more than long enough already, it wouldn't be right to skip the portable version. The old portable fusion reactor is from Nowvis, but the new fusion system is at the end of space age, so obviously something needed to change. The old portable fusion reactor from 1.1 has been renamed to the portable fission reactor and has a nice new icon to better represent it. The recipe has been updated to include a uranium fuel cell. It's still 750 kilowatts or 1.875 megawatts if legendary. A new portable fusion reactor is unlocked with the fusion system. It's an upgrade of the fission version that is more powerful. 2.5 megawatts of base quality or 6.25 megawatts if legendary. Wowza. Okay, and here they are. I think these look amazing, basically. It's a bit weird, if I'm totally honest, that this looks like a backpack, even though it would presumably be something that fits into and you could put multiple in. But it still looks amazing. It actually looks like some sort of bot that would be sat on, sitting on in your backpack on the back with a sort of great big glowing eye. Classic engineer just carrying around a portable fission reactor, but there you go. Alt text on it just says portable fission reactor tech icon and portable fusion reactor tech icon on the second one. So this one, as I said, it's based on the Back to the Future, it's a Back to the Future Easter egg, and the Mr. Fusion, it even sort of says Mr. Fusion on the side. Not quite, but yeah, it's based on that sort of design. Now, what that means, I think, is that this is the only, if you've not got the expansion, then this replaces the current, fusion generator, basically. So you will instead have a fusion generator. It has exactly the same stats as the current one, so you're not losing anything, but it is replacing the recipe and what have you, and that recipe now includes a uranium fuel cell. I am pretty sure that still means that you don't have to fuel it. There are some mods that add the fueling of things that you put in your equipment pack, but I'm pretty sure this means that they've just changed the recipe so it has a uranium fuel cell, and that's meant to then last for the entire rest of the game, basically. So I don't think we're getting a requirement to fuel our personal equipment sort of thing with our fuel. But basically what it means is that we're now getting these, if you're just playing vanilla, no Space Age. You will only get this one if you're playing Space Age and you use the fusion system. Obviously, we're seeing the icon. This is how it represents it, like in the tech tree. This isn't the actual thing you would put in your equipment pack. That's a slightly different representation of the same design. So we'll have to see what those actually look like later. But I mean, I'll be honest, I think this looks 100% better than this. This looks a little plain now. I think maybe if this glowed, because it's clearly glowing with the green stuff, maybe if this had a glow in here, it'd be a bit more, pink glow sort of thing. But at the moment, it just looks like it's sort of inert, basically. Conclusion. The fusion system makes a lot of power in a relatively small amount of space. Since the coolant is mostly recycled and the fusion power cells are very energy dense, the system requires very little in terms of inputs to keep going. This makes the system good on space platforms due to the small footprint, low input and high output. It's nice to be able to blast through space on a space platform that isn't limited by power. It's also a good system for planets if you need loads of power, but does rely on imports and it's not trivially simple, so it's not always the best option everywhere. And here we just see it on a platform. I suspect, and I wouldn't be surprised, if some of the platforms we've seen where they had nuclear reactors, perhaps actually this is what they were designed around, maybe around a fusion power plant, and that they sort of tweaked the design so that they wouldn't have to spoil this too early type of thing. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of those platforms were actually using this, because where we saw Foundrys and stuff, it felt like maybe the nuclear reactor wasn't actually going to power it all. But yes, I mean, I think it looks really awesome on this. I think it's a really cool way of doing things. I'm guessing that maybe there's like a port system that's being implemented here, because it is going to require like fuel, to at the very least. In terms of the fluid thing, I'll be speculating about that in a moment. But it's clearly going to use fuel, so you're going to have to get fuel onto it. So presumably at some point it has to go to somewhere where it can refuel. Otherwise, it's not going to have the power. And if we assume that that's one place where you're making power, making your energy cells, then our platform's going to have to go around doing like depot type stuff, where they're going to have to pay a trip to one planet where you're making all your energy cells. And that maybe suggests, does the is interrupts and stuff, do they work for platforms as well? That's not technically something we've had confirmation of. In many cases, if you maximize the efficiency of the fuel system, then you end up with way more power than you need, and that's part of the fun. As always, fuse your thoughts in the usual places. Okay, so this is like a super extra bit to the video where I'm going to sort of talk about fusion in general, partly just because it's a topic I quite enjoy, but also there are maybe some possible things that could they could use in game and that might crop up. So they mention in particular that the design, this here, is meant to look like a tokamak. Okay, a tokamak is actually a way of containing plasma, and obviously that's what this has got in it. It's not specifically necessarily a fusion generator. Okay, they are slightly different in a sense, in that a tokamak is a way of producing a plasma and containing it in a toroid shape. There's a lot of technical words there, but basically a torus is the sort of proper name for a donut shape. Okay, so this here, the ring, is the torus. Okay, and the idea essentially is that if you use magnetic fields, really strong magnetic fields, you can contain a plasma, because a plasma is charged particles. Basically, it's an atom or atoms that have been broken apart, and you've taken the electrons away from the the central nucleus of the atom. Okay, they are separate from each other. They are no longer connected together. Most people know of the sort of classical, the Bohr view of the atom, where it's a nucleus in the middle as a lump, and then electrons float around the outside, and they are lumps in and of themselves. It's not actually true. In reality, electrons are like this fuzzy cloud around the atom, and atoms themselves are fuzzy things because of quantum effects, basically. So it's not quite true, but for this purposes, it's the best way of thinking about it, or simplest way of thinking about it, where you basically, in a plasma, you take that central nucleus and the electrons apart, and they float around freely. Okay, that's a plasma. You can have a plasma that's just the nucleus is, one that's just the electrons, or some mix of the two. But basically, they are then, because they're separate, an atom itself is like electrically neutral. Because you've separated them, they're then affected by electricity and, of course, magnetism, which are two sides of the same coin. Let's not go into that. But basically, you can control a plasma. So a plasma that's produced, these are all plasmas here, basically, where the atoms have been dissociated from the electrons, and you can then control that plasma using electromagnetic fields, in particular magnets for a torus, and stop it from touching anything else. And the idea is that a tokamak is essentially a whole big collection of magnets essentially, that you can control, that you use to shape a torus shape out of plasma. So you inject plasma into your tokamak and you get it to form this shape. Why do you want to do that? Well, what you're trying to achieve is fusion, okay? And fusion, what it's all about is this nuclear binding energy, basically. So if you know the famous E equals mc squared, and that's how you get power out of an atom bomb, essentially, or any kind of fissile process. You have two ways of doing that, essentially. One is to split the atom up, which is why you have these great big uranium atoms, U235, U238, those gigantic atoms. The number refers to the number of protons in the nucleus. There's also neutrons in there as well, so they're great big, heavy atoms that you split in half. And when they split, this chart here, okay, shows the binding energy. So the amount of energy that is kind of wrapped up in the nucleus. And what happens is that you have a peak around iron, okay, and iron is like the highest energy of any atom, essentially, and it's a whole thing. Let's not get into it. But if you break up bigger atoms, then you essentially move up this curve, okay? And every time you move up this curve, these are just a line of atoms of different types of material. So as you see, uranium at the end here is probably the largest, most stable, naturally occurring nucleus with 235 neutrons in its core, or things in its core. And basically, as you split it up, you jump down this curve, okay, or jump up this curve, and that's the amount of energy that's released. So if you split one of these atoms, it splits in two and goes up to here, say, and so that gap, that difference, is the amount of energy that's released. And because of E equals mc squared, although it's a tiny amount of mass, although you're talking about tiny amounts of mass, that whole E equals mc squared thing means that it's an enormous amount of energy. So any kind of small, because you only need about 15 kilograms, I think it is, for an atom bomb. And we won't get into any of that, but basically the idea is if you split these atoms, they go up this curve and release energy in that split. But the other thing you can do is fuse atoms together. So these are tiny. Hydrogen is literally just a proton in its natural, in its most common state, the hydrogen 1, basically. And as you go up, as you stick more neutrons and protons together, making a bigger and bigger atom, you release energy as well. Because of, as I say, there are all sorts of reasons for it, particularly getting into quantum physics. But one of the things you will notice is that helium is up here and above lithium, and that's where you have the noble gases, like the inert gases, basically, that on the periodic table, that set of ones on the, I think they're on the left actually, aren't they? Where they're all perfectly stable, and they're on the right. And, you know, there's all that thing about filled electron rings and all that sort of stuff. And, you know, ignore all of that. But basically, you get these points of stability in this curve. And iron kind of represents like the, you know, like almost in a sense the most stable. And so what happens is whenever you split, you go up that side and you get to iron. Whenever you merge, you go up that side and you get to iron. And going away from iron is very, very difficult, which is why there's quite a lot of iron basically, because when you get supernovas, then, you know, they sort of tend to end up sort of converging towards this iron point. I've gone way off topic, but basically the point is, for doing a very small number of fusions, you notice how sharp this curve is, basically here. So when you drop down, you don't get very much energy out of these big atoms. When you go up, you get a huge amount of energy released, okay? And so this is where you get into that point that creating a torus of plasma is very energy intensive. It requires a lot of power to run the various experiments where people are trying to use tokamaks to get fusion to happen, okay? There's an awful lot of power required to do that, because what they basically do is they squish the plasma, squeeze it down and down and down and down until there's such a density of, particularly, you know, they often use the hydrogen 2, which is a bigger molecule basically, so there's more chance of it hitting. And as they bang together, hopefully, your hope is that you'll get some helium, and so you get this massive jump up here. You also get maybe lithium and maybe, well, you wouldn't probably get carbon, but, you know, as you get these big jumps of the molecules hitting each other, yeah, then they stick together. If you can get them dense enough, hot enough, squished enough together, and the amount of energy that's then released is higher than the jump down here. So you don't need to burn as much fusion fuel to get the same sorts of energy release as you would fission fuel, okay? And you're also talking about using something that's way, way, way more abundant. The universe is basically hydrogen and some other stuff. You know, there is so much hydrogen in the universe. Every single star is predominantly hydrogen. That's its fuel. And so as it, you know, go up this curve, you get enormous energy release, and so it then becomes worthwhile. But, and this is the thing that's being shortcutted, a sense, in Factorio, because it does have that, you know, it's mentioned, it does have that mechanism of you need some power in order to get the fusion reactor to work. You would need an enormous amount of power in real life. But the bit that's being shortcutted is that how do you get that power out? Okay, because it's in the form of pure energy, okay? So it can be used to heat things, but how do you get your plasma safely out? Because your plasma is contained in your tokamak, which is a complete structure. Yeah, there's no like thing you can put in to like suck the heat energy out. And one of the challenges that they are currently trying to solve is that question of, right, well, okay, we can now make plasmas reliably, and we can make fusion happen reliably. We can see that the energy is being produced. How do you actually get that out as power? As I say, because you're dumping a load of energy in, the amount that you get out is way, way better because of this curve, okay? But actually harnessing that power is a real challenge. There are all sorts of other ways of doing fusion. One, for example, is using lasers, where you basically, you know, like use lasers to force things together. Because there is, again, you get into a lot of quantum stuff when you talk about atoms and stuff, but yeah, basically there are other ways of doing fusion. So how does all that relate to Factorio? As I say, one, they're doing a cheat, because the way you would get the power out of this is you would boil water, basically. So you would take all of that plasma, you would get the heat out of it somehow, and as I say, they're trying to work on that bit. You would boil water, turn that water into steam, make electricity using normal turbines. Probably not normal turbines, but some kind of turbine type generation, just as you do with gas, just as you do with coal, just as you do with a lot of heat-based power generation. Okay, so the cheat they're doing is saying, right, well, it somehow plasma turns a rotor and makes electricity as if it was a generator, like a rotating generator. So that's the big cheat they're doing. The advantage, of course, with fusion is because you're not talking about insanely radioactive material just hanging about and very small quantities of material. It's not going to, do a Chernobyl, basically. It's interesting that they have gone for a pink plasma. That, plasmas, you see in the, some of the top mats generally are pink or a sort of a that sort of colour. So to me, I think that's them just trying to be a little bit realistic. But we did see on Fulgora that holmium-related products do have a pink tinge. Okay, so the pack itself is a pink pack. So it could be that holmium is in some way used, I guess, in the production of plasma. By that I mean that the energy packs that you put in could in some way use holmium. So that's another possibility. But in terms of the whole fusion thing, I just wanted to go off on one because it's a fun topic to talk about. I've skipped a lot of points there. If you're into it, of course, you can just look at the Wikipedia yourself, or feel free to ask questions in the chat. But it's a fun topic to talk about. The bigger question to me, looking at it as real fusion in the real world, is what your fuel source is. I think possibly holmium is maybe involved in it just because that's a material we've got, and they're using it for supercapacitors and superconductors and all this sort of thing. Feels like maybe that would be the container. That's what the container is for it. However, most fusion-based systems use either like deuterium, tritium, those sorts of things. Those are fancy names for hydrogen with extra neutrons on it. So they're heavy hydrogen, basically heavy water. So hydrogen is just like a proton, and then if you start adding neutrons on it, then you get deuterium is 2, the Dew, tritium tri is 3, basically. So you've got one proton making it it's still hydrogen, but it's an isotope, as it's called, of hydrogen. And I think therefore that's what we will be using in the plasma. There are other options, of course. As I say, you've got this diagram here. You can, in theory, do fusion with any of these. Carbon has just been highlighted here, for example. That we know there's carbon in the game already, so they could just reuse that. But I suspect we're going to be doing something with hydrogen or maybe helium as the fuel source. Okay. Now, I guess one of the things, the obvious straight away thing to point out about the power cells, are they calling them? Is that it? Energy cells? Is that they are the Blue-tonium. Way back, I mean, it's not that long ago, is it? Back in Friday Facts 408, we did see this thing here, which was clearly a recoloured nuclear fission power cell. And I speculated at the time that perhaps it was some kind of fuel source that, as I've said, when they tend to do placeholder graphics, they tend to use thematically similar ones. So it's, the green one is the fuel for fission power, so the blue one is the fuel for fusion power. Yeah, so I don't know that this is the final icon. They may well change it, but it was a fairly safe bet that was somehow power related. And obviously my speculation, I think I tended to come down more on the side of it being plutonium. But yeah, instead it is a fusion power cell. It's interesting that it has a quality mark still. Having confirmed that it is the fuel, it's interesting that we're going to be able to produce quality versions of it. One would assume that doesn't affect the power of the machine, but instead means that the cell can burn longer, that you don't need to use it very much, which would then tend to back up this point that if you're going to put them on platforms, you want sort of as much energy density out of your fuel cell as you can. You want to just put 100 in here, and then you only have to have fuel it every so often, and it just burns the high quality fuel and just lasts for absolutely ages. Okay. Speaking of that power cell in a practicality sense, we note and we see whenever it's being inserted, it's not being exerted. We're not taking anything out of the fusion reactor. In normal nuclear fission in the game, so where we have these delivery chests, the requesters are requesting in the actual fuel cell, and then the other inserters are putting used fuel cells into the active providers so that it can be reprocessed. That's obviously mimicking how it works in real life, in that you get a lot of nuclear waste, you can reprocess that, and that's how you get plutonium, which is what I was thinking, you see, that perhaps we would be reprocessing the fuel cells, and rather than giving us uranium, we would get plutonium out of them. There are a few mods that do exactly the same thing, so I was thinking maybe they would implement that, and that plutonium could be used in maybe a bigger bomb or something like that, for example. But instead we are getting this plutonium, the energy cell, and it doesn't have a waste product. So when you burn it, you don't have to bother taking out used cells, reprocessing them, etc., which to me again implies that it is a hydrogen or helium burning process, and that's just being released as gas to the atmosphere. Okay, I did mention that we do have this odd pipe poking out here. That could be it just venting off the small amount of helium or whatever that's being produced. There didn't appear to be a way of getting the byproduct out if it was useful, for example. Now, where do we get that plutonium from, or the fuel cell, or the hydrogen, or what have you? One of the distinct possibilities that I've been speculating about is that it is on Aquilo. We've had a confirmation in the previous Friday Facts, the one with the logo. This one here, that the final planet, the 5th planet, which we believe to be called Aquilo, promises some of the most unique gameplay, but it remains shrouded in mystery. Furthest planet from the sun, so it's dark and cold. So it's all frozen, basically. It's just covered in ice, maybe, for example. Therefore, you can easily see, hydrogen in its heavy forms will happily form water. So you get what's called heavy water, deuterium and tritium water, basically, where it combines with oxygen. So it could be that we have to mine up, we have to melt, we have to do something with heavy hydrogen, heavy water, something like that on Aquilo, in order to get the heavy hydrogen, the tritium, the deuterium that we then use in the nuclear fusion fuel cell. Okay, and I say it's then just burned up, it's just used up, and we don't have to bother about waste materials. I suspect because this is a late game power thing, the way it's very specifically talked about in the Friday Facts is that you're getting this once you've been to all the planets. Yeah, you've done all the planets. You get this new power source, it helps you build your big base. Maybe it's the way that you win the game. You need an enormous amount of power to win the game, perhaps. We certainly know that you need an enormous amount of power in order to run a lot of these new machines. So maybe it just helps you scale up your base if you're doing a mega base, that sort of thing. Maybe it's fairly optional that you just want to do it because it's fun, basically. But yes, the implication is that it is somehow related to the final planet, and that perhaps this is another one where I've had this speculation quite a few times. In order to make the fuel cell, in order to make the cooling fluid, in order to make the machine itself, you need to bring in holmium, you need to bring in tungsten, you need to bring in whatever Gleba produces, whatever it's called, that bio thingy, and that you have to bring everything together. Maybe you do need nuclear stuff from Nauvis or something. You bring it all together, and then you make both the cooling fluid and the actual cells and the actual machine, and therefore it becomes your end game power. Because you need to make the fuel for it, like from an Aquilo thing, to me that suggests that that's the only place you will be able to make it. We have this thing that a lot of the products for a planet are kind of locked to being produced on that planet. So you can't process tungsten anywhere else but Vulcanus. I would suggest the same thing for this, that point that it makes about the complexity of the logistics and it not being suitable for every planet is basically saying that the only place you can make the fuel is on Aquilo, and Aquilo, of course, is far away. So is that the most practical thing to bring it all the way to Vulcanus in order to make a fusion reactor there? Fulgora, interestingly, is, I believe, like the furthest out of the intermediate planets because it's colder and it's darker and all that sort of stuff. So to me, the talk about Fulgora is basically confirming the same thing, that's probably the most practical planet to go to because it doesn't have any water. it's darker, less native power, or more complex power in a sense. It's not necessarily less, but it's very variable with the whole lightning thing. So maybe that's actually a good place to do it. And then that maybe Gleba's quite a useful place because of the whole platform thing. The being able to have fast platforms that aren't reliant on grabbing asteroids to fuel themselves, or power themselves, rather. The phrasing of this generally is quite interesting, talking about Aquilo. Later, when you head to the 4th new planet, which so will be Aquilo, nuclear becomes a much better option because the solar power is so low. We know it's all dark and cold out there, and ice is more abundant. Now, is it saying ice like ice on the planet, or is it referring to a prevalence of asteroids, icy asteroids? I believe they have sort of said on Discord that it's quite hazardous to go to Aquilo, there's lots and lots and lots of big asteroids. And I believe there's probably going to be an asteroid field that you have to specifically travel through, and that therefore, it's not an easy place to get to, sort of thing. And so it could be that there's just tons and tons of ice in the asteroids, and that's what it's referring to. But to me, as I say, it feels more like there's ice on the planet, and that ice contains heavy water ice, which you use to get your fuel. The other question then is the cooling fluid. I, again, suspect that is made on Aquilo. That's a locked thing to Aquilo. It could use anything, all sorts of fluids are used in cooling in the real life, from alcohols to even water is a cooling fluid, So I think that's probably locked to a production on Aquilo as well, and that therefore you have to ship it off, because interestingly, what it actually says about the coolant is that since the coolant is mostly recycled and the fusion power cells are very energy dense, the system requires very little in terms of inputs to keep going. So that, to me, is saying that the coolant will run out. You don't get perfect return of coolant from the cycle, essentially. So when it goes through the cooler, maybe it's quite a small loss, that you maybe put in 100 and you get 99.9 out, although we know you can't do fractional things now. So put in 100, get 99 out, I guess. But it's going to have some sort of loss in it, which makes sense. It's being heated and cooled and heated and cooled and heated and cooled. Losing some wouldn't be unreasonable. And that means you do need to top it up, okay? You need to restock it. But anyway, I think the idea is that the loss is tiny, and that it just means every so often it has to go back, get more fluid. Because at the very least, if you're building one of these on a planet, like we see here on Gleba, you've got to charge this system. You've got to fill up these pipes in order to get this system to work, okay? Now, because it's a thing that's used on platforms and is apparently a good solution for certain types of platforms, to me, that begs the question, how are we getting fluids from the surface of a planet up to the platforms? I mentioned before about having a barreling station and all that sort of stuff. Is that going to be a part of the game? If not, how are we getting fluid onto a rocket without barrels? Okay, is there a new fluid rocket being developed? I very much doubt it. I think we're going to have to mess about with barrels, which could be quite annoying, if I'm honest. The other speculation point on the cooling fluid is simply around what's it made of, where is it from, etc. So it could be made of anything, but we do see that there is a specific building for cooling, which takes in the hot coolant and outputs the normal temperature coolant for you to cycle it back round again. If we are talking about a cold planet and heat management, this all ties into me that this is a building that can only be made on Aquilo. Now, one of the things they have said is that they don't like single-use buildings. Okay, they've got a few, particularly the power things, although even there, you take, for example, coal liquefaction requires steam, so you have reuses of some of these buildings for things like that. So, it is something they do try to have, is that no single-use buildings, which again, we do have, say, with like the nuclear fission and nuclear fusion, presumably as well. But certainly the production buildings they like to use for other things. And I have been speculating wildly that perhaps cooling is something we want to do for some reason. Are there things that we can make that require cold temperatures or things that we can make that require, I don't know, say crystallization, or something that requires a cool liquid or something like that. An obvious candidate is computing and things like that, that if you're making a supercomputer or something like that, you would want to cool it down. We know that from Fulgora we're getting supercapacitors, we're getting superconductors. Those require, in the real world, those require cooling. You do not have room temperature superconductors. Is that what we get from Aquilo? That those have uses and they're not redundant, before that, but you get to a point where you need to use them in some way that requires them to be cooled down. Okay, and that perhaps that's what we get from Aquilo is cooling. That's its mechanic. They've very clearly demonstrated that they are very willing to introduce new mechanics. That's almost the point of the expansion. And we had on this one, the space age date announcement one, that the fifth planet promised the most unique gameplay. Is that about temperature management, basically? It would be an interesting thing to introduce just from a consistency point of view, because we don't have to manage temperature in any of the heating things we do at the moment. So maybe temperature management only applies for cooling, that it's about cooling things. But yes, I suspect, as I say, that the cooling is an Aquilo exclusive activity, that the building you use to do that is that one there, and that you can only build that, develop that on Aquilo. What's interesting about it is it doesn't have an additional input. When you look at this building, all it appears to be taking in is the hot fluid and outputting the cold fluid, basically. So it doesn't look like it's using some kind of material in order to get that cooling to happen. So I've done the separate images here just to be able to zoom in. We can't really tell much of what's going on with this building here, although I suspect there's a little bit of a sneaky peeky at it in another one of the images. But yeah, obviously this has just been wiped out with paint, basically, or Photoshop or something. They're not even sort of going to the trouble of putting in a grey box or something. They're just literally wiping it out. So obviously it's quite a big building. It seems to be a very similar size to the actual reactor itself. My assumption is it works on power. That the cooling effect that it does requires power. So effectively, even if this is like a 900 megawatt build, the actual thing itself uses power, which is that whole thing of making the plasma, but then this coolant requires power as well. So you've got to have some way of kick-starting this whole thing, which is why we're seeing solar panels throughout the build, just to give it a little bit of power to get it running. The bit I wanted to point out, though, is if you notice at the top here, there's sort of a bit of a structure like that. I don't know if you can see that, which I think is almost probably like a pipe or something that's part of the build on the top of it. And you see the same thing here. So if it is, an artifact of scrubbing this out, then, they've managed to accidentally create the same shape as well. But we also see sort of like a hood here, almost like like it could be something, with an entrance, like a hole in it or something like that. And the reason I say that is that if we go absolutely mad on the zoom here, I think this is the same building. I think the cooling building is on the bottom here. Okay, this a lot of it is repeats this. That part there is that so that's another generator basically, and I think there's some on the side as well. I think that's the side of a generator and all that sort of thing. But I think this is the cooling thing, because that shape, I think, is what's hidden by the the scrubbing out. Yeah, so I think that shape. Yeah, and it's also got a little bump there. Is this here? So I think this is the very bottom, very top rather, of the cooling thing. So it also has that sort of a that looks very similar to the refinery and stuff like that, doesn't it? So you're keeping in thematically the same. So I think these are the three connection points for the cooling thing. So it's connecting there. And that would therefore mean that this is that part of it. I'm puzzled as to what that part is and whether that's part of the machine as well. It's like a set of pipes going along, because that would appear to be out of the footprint, I think. If that's pipe 1, 2, 3, then you've got pipe 1, 2, 3. So it doesn't look like it's got something poking out the side here. So that almost looks like there's something else, like there's another building there. Yeah, what is this part of? Because to me, it doesn't look like a pump or anything like that. It doesn't look like part of this machine. So I'm wondering if there's something else going on here as well, and that this can connect to something else. But yes, I believe this is the very top of the cooling building. And we see exactly the same. I've just moved over, if you can't tell. It's the same thing again here. The same stuff is repeated. Yeah, so this one doesn't have a thing here. It would be sort of there. That, multiple, pipe thing. But yes, I think this is the, cooling building. That's a little bit of a sneaky peek at it. What's a little bit less clear to me is whether this is also the cooling building. It looks to be different to the others because it has the 3 pipe outputs on it. It's got 3, 2, 3, and it's also connected to the, cold fluid, basically, the one that's coming into the reactors. So I suspect it probably is. It's a little difficult to tell on this one though, because, we've got so little, we've basically got the standard pipe connection essentially. But I think that is probably the bottom, the bottom part of that cooling machine, which is interesting because it has that sort of sweep like a chemical plant does, because it's got almost like a gap in the, where, you can just see the floor basically. So it's got, it suggests it's got some kind of tank in the actual design, and perhaps we're then seeing maybe a radiator. These bits on here are representing a radiator, because one of the things it could be, one of the reasons the ways this could work in the game fiction, and why I'm slightly puzzled there isn't apparently some other fluid being added, is that if you're melting liquid stuff on Aquila, could there be like liquid helium or something like that you would cool down liquid helium and that transport that around, and that's what you would use as a consumable in order to cool your coolant basically. But since we don't seem to see any other fluids going in that mock-up one, I think it's not like that, and all you have to do is occasionally recharge it, and it will just radiate heat out and therefore cool the fluid basically. So I think that's the top of it, and I think that's the bottom of it. Yeah, because that there looks like it's a chopped away piece, that's just a thing. We can also see on that one, just the corner as well. I think if I was very good at Photoshop, I could probably piece together, like that top part and that bottom part. I don't know if that really tells us anything, it's just cool. Okay, so in terms of the building itself, I think this probably answers the question of what the green building was in this Factorio Friday Facts 399. We saw it here, and at the time I did speculate that it seemed to be using some kind of adjacency bonus. It would also, obviously we have to remember that this might be like an early version of it, and maybe it was using pipes and all that sort of stuff, but it certainly looks like these are maybe the reactors. These are maybe the reactors, the green one, and then the actual generators are the blue ones, because they seem to be directly connected, and these would be making use of the adjacency bonus. It would also kind of explain why they were, shifted off center, as it were, so that if there are 4 reactors here, you could well imagine that in that shape, that sort of crossed up shape. It does also make me wonder if maybe this dark blue one is the cooling machine, which would make it slightly smaller than the reactor, and obviously it's square rather than oblong, because it just seems to fit in the right place, in that you've got what could well be pipes going around the edge, which have got the coolant in, and then this is like a self-contained system, except for the fact that you've got the need to bring in the fuel every so often, and I guess top up the coolant, and that's why it's got roboports on it. So I think this is basically the confirmation that this was a power system. Obviously we got this mention here of of Gleba and showing it on here. There are a couple of sort of incidental things that were just interesting to me. First off, it's raining again. It seems maybe that Gleba will always rain, so there's a question of, does that have any impact, or is that just for atmosphere and what have you? We know that on Fulgora we're getting lightning strikes from, essentially from the clouds, basically. So that's a whole new weather type system that's being put in. So does water, does rain mean something on Gleba? Because, and you know me, I see mountains where there are molehills, but if we notice it, so this is, I assume, decoratives, but they could actually be some kind of like proper plant. They're not actually just decorative. And this one here appears to have grown up on landfill, which, to the best of my knowledge, you don't get being, decoratives being spawned on landfill. So this could be a new thing for the game, that just generally you can have things spawn on landfill. But of course, when we were initially introduced to Gleba, we had the mention of spores, and could it be that this is some kind of system where there are plants on Gleba that if you let them, grow, basically, the spores will land, because there was another one where I was speculating the same thing. It was a weirdly positioned decorative. Of course, it could just be problems with spawning. It could be that decorative is always there, and when they put the landfill in, it was just there and it never got rid of it because it's, early version, etc., etc. There are plenty of more sensible reasons for why this might have happened. But I just wondered if one of the mechanics on Gleba is that when it rains, all of these spores start spawning plants, and the plants can damage your stuff, and that basically you have to have some mechanism for cleaning them up. I don't think that will be in the game, if I'm honest. I'm just putting a speculation out there, but I don't think it will be in the game because it would just be annoying, I think. I don't know that what you would gain from it. It was just interesting to note that this appeared to be some kind of plant growing on landfill, and we do know we're getting special nutrient rich, as it were, landfill for Gleba that you can use to grow your plants. So perhaps you have to guard against him. Perhaps you do become a gardener and you have to weed the plants off of your landfill, basically, is what I'm wondering. I guess the other thing to note is these appear to be pink lamps. We kind of had like a statement saying somewhere that we were going to get the ability to just change the colour of lamps, because they're not wired into anything. You see, they're not connected via green wire or anything like that. So I think this might be one of our first sights of coloured lamps, with just setting the colour of the lamp. I don't recall having seen that before, but certainly they look very pink to me. I guess the other point is that we've seen lots and lots of, well, we haven't seen lots and lots, we've seen a few platforms, and they've always seemed to be slightly hampered to a degree by the fact that you need to collect asteroids in order to process them to make the fuel. A lot of it is reliant on power, you see. And what I've been wondering, basically, is that as you send a platform out to Aquilo, we know that the solar is less and that you get less power, and we have seen nuclear power on a platform, but nuclear power requires an enormous amount of water to run. So my question was always, well, is that really a practical and sensible way of doing things? You'd need an enormous number of solar panels, or legendary ones. You'd need enormous amount of water for a nuclear fission process to run. So is this like the best way of getting out to Aquilo? But also, is it therefore the best way to do fast ships from Gleba carrying your spoiled materials? Because, and it's just as a side note, it's interesting, there is a cooling mechanic in and we're not getting refrigeration. That seems weird. But anyway, because, this nuclear power plant, this fusion power plant would take care of all of the power demands of your things. So you could have loads of grabber arms on it to gather asteroids to get your actual engines working. Yeah, you're not restricted as much by having to, because one of the things, of course, is if you put loads of solar panels on it, it's then a big platform, so it weighs a lot, so it's slow. If you put nuclear power on it, somehow you've got to stuff it full of, barrels of water. If you use this, you can just have it occasionally pop over and top up with the fuel it needs, which sounds like is not going to be very often at all. And you can also do quality fuels. And so basically it can take care of all of your power needs, have as many grabber arms as you want, as many crushers as you want, as many chemical labs as you want, given the weight restrictions. And therefore it, can zip around the solar system, transporting this spoiled or spoiling material. So that sounds like maybe that's, the way around it. That when you get to the scale of, right, well, I want to build big, I got to build these platforms with the fusion reactor on it instead, and then it can be fast ships everywhere. That does also beg the question, I might mention this during the actual read-through, but is interrupts going to be a thing for platforms as well? My assumption has always been yes, it will, and that they will basically operate like trains. Trains we know are getting the interrupt system, so will platforms also have interrupts? And that's how you can basically ensure that this thing only refuels every so often. In my SpaceX playthrough that I'm doing, I've set up like a depoting system, and it's an absolute pain in the bum because every train has to go there basically every time it does a complete loop. And so you need loads and loads of depots, and you can't just say, right, you've run out of fuel, go and get some more fuel, or you've got less than 10% fuel, go and get some more fuel. And that's what we're going to be able to do with interrupts. We're going to be able to say to it, right, interrupt of an interrupt, you're out of fuel, go head over to Aquilo and top up. I wonder maybe if this was perhaps one of the special cases that they were talking about of why you need interrupt of interrupt, that it can be flying all the way to a different planet and then realise it's run out of fuel and it has to divert. What it does make me wonder is one thing they could do is plasma could be a weapon, of course. You could have some kind of way of casting plasma. Warhammer 40k has like a plasma rifle thing. So it's that type of idea that you get a stream of plasma, get a way of making plasma, and you can blast plasma, at an enemy. Now we did obviously see in the very recent Friday Facts this weird thing sat on the belt that looks like it's shooting something out of it. So given the engineer develops the capability to generate plasma, could this be a plasma thrower or a plasma blaster or some sort of thing like that? I don't think it is. I still think this is a lightning type weapon because it's blue, basically. It's a blue thing shooting out, and we've tended to see like colour similarity in a sense, in that, for example, here, we've got blue bits of asteroid and blue water. Yeah, you keep the same sort of colours to make sure players know exactly what's going on, what's being used and what's happening is kept colour similar, basically. So in other words, I think if this was blasting out plasma, I think this would be a pink stream, okay? And as I say, it opens the possibility to me that the engineer could do some more stuff with plasma. I don't think that happened, not least because they're very clear you can't put plasma in pipes. We could get some kind of special thing that, allows you to move plasma around, some sort of magnetic containment thing. But yeah, it'd be kind of fun to play with a lot of that stuff, I think. Last couple of ones were just then sort of wondering about these guys, because this is obviously a bright blue colour. And we saw the fuel cell is also a bright blue colour. It's a very similar blue to me. It's not the same. That's not exactly the same, I don't think, as that blue. But it's interesting we're getting two bright blue things. So is this telling us that these shells are made of the same stuff as the actual, energy cells, basically? Is the whatever's going on, because these aren't, one of the things I wondered is whether these were plasma shells, that's what this means. But again, we're not using pink, we're using blue, okay? And we've got a blue, fuel cell. So perhaps whatever these are made of is also in them, because they're both glowy as well. So I don't know, what would that mean? That could mean that if it is requiring a bunch of materials, holmium, tungsten, whatever, in order to make the actual fuel cell itself, and then it's just filled up with, heavy hydrogen, then it could mean that these shells are made of tungsten or holmium or some combination of that in order to do what they're going to do. The bit that's really weird about them, I say, is that, well, first off, as I've speculated, I don't actually think they're cannon shells. I think they might be, like a railgun shell or something like that, or some other weapon. So it would make a bit more sense. But if you're introducing a new cannon shell, you've got nuclear cannon shells, and you've got nuclear missiles and things like that. So nuclear is like the end point. How would you introduce something that was more powerful? What would you go for? You could have a fission bomb, you see. Sorry, fusion bombs are usually made bigger than fission bombs. So perhaps it's that. It's a fusion bomb cell in some way. Because it sort of doesn't make sense as an intermediate between the two. It could be that we're not going to get nuclear, atomic weapons until right to the end, maybe? And that therefore we need some intermediates. But it's a bit strange to, if it's a tungsten shell, then it's a bit strange to introduce something that's, probably going to be redundant fairly quickly. I mean, I guess it depends what order planets you go to and all that sort of stuff. But, if you've got nuclear shells with their exploding effect and then you've got, atomic weapons at the end and you've got artillery, and why introduce things in the middle? It feels a bit pointless. So to me, it feels more like it should be a special purpose weapon, like asteroid killer or something like that. So, it could be that it's some kind of fusion weapon, but I suspect it's more because perhaps when you take, purpley tungsten carbide and pink holmium, you get blue materials or something. That'd be a bit strange, bit of a strange combination, but you never know. So yeah, the question basically is whether or not these blue shells are related to the blue fuel cells. Oh, and I suppose just to end off on that note, at the moment, when you blow up a nuclear reactor, it basically goes off like a nuclear bomb. So does that mean if we blow up one of these, if I shoot one of these reactors, am I going to get a fusion explosion, basically? Now, as I say, because fusion is like different, you would expect it just to melt down and be self-contained. But, it wouldn't be very fun to have a system where it's, you've got all this contained power, and then when you blow it up, it just, the building just collapses or whatever. Especially since, we're seeing this on Gleba, and we know there's the big stompy boy on Gleba. If he walks through this, does this basically blow up with enough force to kill him, but also takes out half your base at the same time? That would be quite an interesting dilemma, because then you're sort of in the territory of, well, do I use it if I can't get rid of him yet? I'm too early to get rid of him. I don't see why you would be too early if this is very late game, but it would be kind of fun if the guy turns up and just, walks through your nuclear power, fusion powers thing, kills himself blowing it up, but then also there's just this enormous crater on that used to be your base. And this was always the appeal of cold fusion, which is, I'm kind of wondering if effectively what we're saying is that maybe the backpack one is like a cold fusion device. That's, it's not going to say it, but maybe that's what's going on. Why it's a smaller one and doesn't require power in order to run, as it were, and just gives electricity. But that's why cold fusion is so attractive, because if you can find some way, and it's what a lot of cold fusion is, basic experiment that sparked all of that interest all those years ago was that there is a substance that can basically absorb hydrogen, and what people are trying to do is cram enough of like heavy hydrogen into it that it would force the atoms to come together and therefore release heat. And of course, because it's on a very small scale and you're not talking having a massive plasma that's all hot, you can literally put that in water, the heavy water maybe, and therefore you can boil it, get the power out really easily, or just heat it up and use heat exchangers, that sort of thing. So that was always the appeal of the cold fusion. It's almost impossible in reality, because in order to hit these atoms together, you need an enormous amount of power and energy. And I guess just to round off, what do I think of it? I think it's great, basically. I mean, do I really need to say that? I think it's awesome that we're getting a new fusion power system. In a sense, I don't care what it is. The fact that fusion is just cool, really. It could have been a new plutonium based power system. I love that it's going to be opening up all sorts of ways of building, with bonuses, adjacency bonuses that work with skewed buildings, and you can use generators as peaking power and all this sort of stuff. I think it's going to be really quite fun. I hope you enjoyed today's Friday Facts video and might consider coming back for another one. If you'd like to chat about the latest Factorio Friday Facts, then you can find me live streaming Factorio every weekend over my Twitch channel at Trismegistus. Thanks for watching. Cheers. .420 blazing.